Hey there, I'm back for episode 4 of this series, Irony as the Truest Medicine. I just got back from a week in Vienna. Last minute, I was invited, all expenses paid, to an invitation-only conference of biophilosophers. This would include all sorts of academics, some of them theoretical biologists, some of them philosophers, some of them biology firsters who then got into philosophy, some the other way around. There were only about 30 of us there. Many had high academic standing, and there was no audience for it. It was a collaboration, an opportunity for us to think about what agency is, what selves are. And I found throughout the week some disconnects that were hard for me at first to understand. And then I realized there's a difference between the things we were attempting to do, and all of this pertains to what I'm trying to do here in this series. There were people who didn't seem very interested in what I would call the deep etiological explanation for what life is. Trying to understand what life is, starting from a physical grounding, starting from chemistry. What is agency? What are selves? What is trying? What is function, that is utility or fittedness? I think of the challenge that has fascinated me for these 30 years as how to explain how you'd get selves making functional interpretive effort, how they would ever emerge from nothing but physical chemistry. And I would say maybe half of the people there, all of them very careful, thoughtful thinkers, lots of historians of science as well, people who do very careful research on the exploration that scientists have done. They didn't actually seem that interested in this question that I consider just fundamental. What are selves and how did they start? They're more interested in analyzing what selves do, given that they exist and we can look at their behavior. We can try to understand how their behavior works and how to more accurately describe what they do and how to figure out what they do better, but not actually what they are and how they emerge from what preceded them. I realized I was dealing with two kinds of people. Some are philosophers of science, interested in how we interpret living beings, how scientists work, and how they could work better, perhaps. Some of them are closer to just trying to understand what science as a practice really is, and others seem to have positions about what we should take into account when we're doing scientific research. That is, some of them are just trying to understand us, trying to understand scientists, and some are talking about how to do science better. I really am a natural philosopher. What do I mean by that? Philosophy in light of nature, or philosophy with no room for supernatural or extranatural capacities. I'm trying to understand what I am, and that is the motivation that got me into this work in the first place. I am engaged in something that deserves more attention or more value than it gets in our society. It looks a lot like a spiritual practice, and it's very spirited, but it has no room for spirit in the original sense of the term. Spirit as metaphorically something non-physical that is breathed into physical matter to make it come alive. So when we talk about spirit, it's a very vague term. I've often commented that the term spirit can be defined any way you want, but it mostly means shut up. A little snarky for me to say it that way, but what I mean by that is that if you can't figure something out, you could just call it spiritual and get people to stop asking about it. It is a way of saying shut up. And there are lots of ways of saying shut up, and they are popular. I call them noping strategies. Nope, don't go there. So if you ask someone why they believe something, or if you ask them about some inconsistency in their beliefs, they can say, well, it's spiritual. you wouldn't understand unless you were spiritual. In that sense, what I'm really talking about is a kind of term for dualism. Dualism means that there are two realms. There's the physical realm, the natural realm, and then there's this other realm. It could be called spiritual, it could be called consciousness. You give a name to something that you can't explain, and then you use that name as an explanation. And it's not exclusively the religious or spiritual who'll do that. My sense is that lots of people do it. It comes really naturally to human beings that we would do that. We'd say, well, it comes from some other source, and then we give a name to that source. It's that added ingredient, the mystery, the secret sauce, whatever. And then we don't have to think about it anymore, so it's a noping strategy. We're good at pointing out that in each other's accounts, and then to claim that because we can point it out in other people's accounts, it proves we don't have it. So just think about the competition between religions or spiritual perspectives. Competition between religions is where this is most obvious. You've heard it many times, I'm sure. The atheists argue that they're just like the religious, except that they add one more religion to the list of bogus belief systems. Christians don't believe in Thor or Zeus, and an atheist doesn't believe in Thor, Zeus, or God. But why are they able to say that? Well, because the religious are often very disdainful of other people's supernatural claims, as if it proves they don't make any. Since your religion is bogus or unrealistic, mine must be realistic. And I would say the same thing happens in the sciences. It's just one of the problems we have in the sciences. I think that we haven't had formidable enough opponents for a while. So I'm an atheist, but I also am not the kind of atheist who thinks that natural selection solves it all. I love listening to the new atheists. I loved Sam Harris's work before it got too much in the direction that I'm suggesting right now. I really liked Christopher Hitchens' work. But the problem, the vocational hazard for people who are slamming religion, is that it's too easy a target. We should have formidable opponents, because if we don't have to think through our own perspectives more, because we can just slam other perspectives. It's what I call defaulty logic. Since they're wrong, I must be right by default. I see that even in the sciences. Someone can discredit another theory for having unexplained explanations and think, therefore, that their explanation doesn't have that problem. I'm at this conference, listening to different perspectives, and a lot of nuanced, fine-tuned analysis of, for example, normativity. Normativity is better for or worse for an organism. Philosophers of science were trying to work out the details of how you would know whether something was good or bad for an organism. In the meantime, I'm sitting there thinking, don't you want to figure out how normativity emerges in the first place? Wouldn't that be the best way to get to know what normativity is, or how to even think about normativity? What do I mean by normativity? It just means better or worse in the inorganic world. If you're talking about non-living things, there's nothing that's good or bad. It just happens. A chemical reaction by itself, if there's no living being around, no beneficiary, a chemical system is not good or bad. There's no normativity. In religion, and to some extent in spirituality, there's an assumption that good and bad are there at the origins of the universe. And I'm saying, well, that doesn't seem right. That's not how we think in general in chemistry. In chemistry, nothing is good, nothing is bad until there's a beneficiary. Who's that beneficiary? Well, be the first organism. When I talk about selves making functional interpretive effort, those are all four terms that define each other. What is a self? It's a beneficiary of function, of goodness or badness. Something is either useful or not useful, productive or counterproductive for an organism, that is making effort, that is trying to do something. Functional interpretive effort, those terms all define each other. Let me step back, because I probably missed this beat. I said a little while ago that the reason I'm interested in these questions is that I came into this work trying to figure out what the actual fuck I am. I thought I'd have a better chance at living in ways that worked if I knew what I actually was, if I wasn't operating on fantasies. Now, I think what I just said is debatable, but I do think that one of the best uses one could make of one's life, if one was safe and free enough to do so, is the detective work of figuring out what the actual fuck you are. Isn't that the most interesting riddle around? Because of my lucky circumstances, it became my practice, is trying to figure out what the actual fuck I am, despite my appetite for, let's say, more flattering self-description, despite my human capacity to weave all sorts of narratives. I thought, what about if I actually tried to figure out what I am? Those fanciful narratives generally borrow dualistically. That is, you imagine fairy dust. You imagine, as the scientists do, a separate substance called information that isn't physical, but somehow gets embedded in the physical. When we talk about DNA as an information-bearing molecule, we're doing dualism. We're actually echoing something important in one of the most important scientists in the Enlightenment. So you got this guy, René Descartes. He came up with a way to finally bind together mathematical equations and physical geometry. He came up with the Cartesian graph system. But he also struggled to figure out what he was and came to the conclusion that he was two things. He was the Enlightenment's big dualist. He was res extensa, which is matter extended in 3 dimensions, the stuff he tracked in his graphs. But he was also res cogitans. He was this thinking thing. That's where he got that thing, I think, therefore I am. He came to the conclusion that because he had this added thinking capacity, that meant that he was two things. He was matter, but he was also consciousness. And then he got into this question of how the two are connected. How does consciousness enter into matter? And he came up with a ridiculous solution. Even in his own day, it was considered ridiculous, which was that there's some kind of like connection between thinking and matter that happens in the pineal gland, because it was central to the brain and there was only one, so he figured that might be like the antenna where we get our consciousness. When scientists today look back on Descartes, they, for the most part, say he's ridiculous. First of all, pineal gland, that's absurd. But beyond that, we don't want to be dualists. We don't want to pretend there's this extra stuff. We're trying to be strictly physical. And then, if they go on and claim, the way that Sam Harris might, or any of the new atheists do, that DNA is an information-bearing molecule, what are they doing? It's exactly the same thing. They imagine this other substance called information, and they imagine it somehow being born by matter. So DNA is a molecule, but it's a special molecule because it's information-bearing. So I'm trying to avoid all of those dualisms. I want to actually figure out what the actual fuck I am. And to do that, I have to actually figure out how my selfhood, my capacity to interpret, thereby making information in the world. Anything could become information, but it's only information when some being interprets it for their effort. I have to explain all of that within nothing but physical chemistry. So, why would any of this nerdy or esoteric sounding stuff matter to anyone in the general public? I go back to this acknowledgement. You don't have to understand what you are to be you. It's perfectly satisfying and in many ways much less complicated to not know what the actual fuck you are. But for those interested in a sport that is also a way of life, then the thing I'm talking about, trying to figure out what the actual fuck you are, is, I think, just a blast. It's not the consolations that you can get from some dualistic belief in faith or God's protection or the spirit wanting to bring about happiness in the world. But if you want to live fully, there's an advantage to it. Coming back from this conference, I recognize that there are people just trying to understand how science works. And then there are people who are trying to figure out what the actual fuck we are. I was kind of an outlier because I was trying to figure out what the actual fuck we are for personal application too. I don't leave my ego at the door when I do my research. I take it into the lab. I'm trying to apply what I learn about us to me, to my personal life. I'm trying to live consistently with what I find out about what the actual fuck I am. It makes me spirited, non-spiritual, that is not dualistic, practice. And it's a real living practice. That's really what I'm trying to offer in this podcast. And there's no reason anyone should feel obligated to take it. I understand why other paths are more reassuring, more comforting. I don't say that pedantically. I don't say that to put that down. I know what it's like as a human being to need comfort, confidence, reassurance. I know that well. And I know, therefore, that trying to figure out what the actual fuck we are, and I do have explanations. You can decide whether they're right or wrong, but I do have an explanation for what I am. It's a damn good and relatively untried, very rigorous, highly realistic explanation for what we are. Buy it or not, I don't care. I'll put it out there, and that's what I'll be doing in the remains of this series, and also pointing to how it really suggests that irony is the truest medicine. But I understand why people would choose other spiritual or religious or even scientific but dualistic approaches to all of this. Let me explain. With this etiological approach, etiology meaning you explain what something is by what caused it or what brings it about in the first place. You start at the beginning. You start with a minimal self. You don't start with consciousness. You don't start with, human nature. You start with living nature. What would be universal to all living nature and its original, most minimal form? To do that work, you need a model for a self struggling for its own existence, a self trying to stay alive, a self making functional interpretive effort. What that would be in strictly physical terms. And it wouldn't start out looking anything like us other than it does some work to protect itself against degeneration. And it also does some work, what I'd call effort, to repair, regenerate. For my etiological approach, I have to assume that I've got to have an explanation that's strictly physical, those supernatural add-ons, and produces a minimal but not just impressionistic self struggling for its own existence. But here's a intuition pump I came up with this week. I'll probably be making a separate video about it. It's a curious thing that you're very likely to be alive tomorrow. When you stop to think about it, given what we know about the physical universe, it's kind of weird. It's not a likely outcome in straight up physical chemistry. One way to picture it, I've mentioned this before, is imagine how fast you would decay if you died in no time, like a half hour. There'd be no resurrecting you. That's how fast you would decay by default. So there is this question, We don't tend to ask it this way. But what made it so it was improbable for you to fall apart? What is it that made it improbable that you would be dead right away in this physical universe where you're decaying all the time, where everything is decaying all the time? We could talk about it as why is it probable that you'll stay alive, but also we could talk about it as why is it improbable that you'll fall apart? What made the default unlikely? The default being that everything falls apart, especially something soft and squishy and fluid like you. Why aren't you decaying? Why aren't you degenerating? What is that? And again, how would it start? Well, it would start very subtly. It would be a slight chance that a chemical system would protect itself against degeneration and repair what degenerates. And over time, if you had a system like that, also replicating, so you had multiple copies of this slightly capable of regenerating itself, it could accumulate better ways to prevent decaying and falling apart. All the way to where it's very likely, not just that you'll be around tomorrow, but years from now. I mean, this is one of the misinterpretations that happens with life. Completely understandable that we would have a bias this way. We assume that staying alive is the default, but it's not realistic to think that way in this universe. In fact, death would be much more the default. It's really peculiar that you've got this physical capability of preventing your own decay. And so to do the etiological approach, to really try to understand what the actual fuck you and I are, starting within nothing but simple physical chemistry, what I'm looking for is a way in which the default probability, decay, becomes unlikely. Not something added, but it's a way in which the default becomes unlikely or improbable. So this is not particularly interesting to biologists because they just assume life and often simply describe mechanistically the different functions of life. So, for example, at this conference I went to, there's a South African researcher, a biochemistry professor of some renown, very capable, who also is interested in biophilosophy, trying to understand life. He got up and gave a presentation. I could never give it. I don't have enough biological and biochemistry background like he does. But he labeled the parts of the body and drew a parallel between what a body does and what you do when you fabricate IKEA furniture. We had a wonderful, feisty debate about how this works. We agreed about some things and disagreed about others. He's a scientist. He's a real scientist. I am not. I'm a philosopher. I'm a natural philosopher at best. But he's a scientist and basically says, well, this part right here is like the IKEA instructions, and this part right here is like the fabricator, and he's got this whole functional model. It's kind of like designing a machine out of it. And then I talked to others at the conference, very esteemed professors, way more studious than I am, who made an argument that you cannot think about us as engineered. And where do they go from there? Well, they either go dualist or they go reductionist, which is that it's just physical chemistry, but they're not particularly interested in explaining how you'd ever get those functions from the physical chemistry that precedes them. And what I'll be doing in the remains of this series, I'll be explaining how the default became increasingly improbable. And I'll be doing it in a way that makes it pertinent to our personal lives, the way that it is for me personally. I take this stuff very personally. The book I started writing that got me going in all this research was called Nothing Personal. I'm not trying to bury the soul. I'm trying to explain souls. So soul is a term like spirit. It implies dualism, as most people think of it. There's your physical body, and then there's your soul. A reductionist would say there is only physical matter, and therefore there is no soul. So convince yourself you're not a self. And you will hear this argument in popular versions of it, scientific versions of it as well. That is not my goal. My goal is to explain souls. But I don't get to give you a soulful account that starts with soul and then expresses what soul is. I have to explain soul from non-soul. So I'm not a religious or spiritual thinker who tells you in the beginning was God's soul or the higher power's soul, and that's why you've got a soul. Nor am I one of these researchers who gives you a soulful account of how you don't have a soul. Examples of this would be Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, Dan Dennett. These are big names in this line of work. The new atheists are generally like this. They are very colorful speakers. They are very spirited. But they're generally pointing to a universe where there is no soul, where there's only mechanism, some of which falls apart. So there's differential survival of mere mechanism, but there's no soul. So you've got the soulful people who are explaining the soulful expressions of soulful assumptions about the universe that explain why you've got a soul. So that would be a colorful theological or spiritual explanation for the universe's soul and how you ended up with it. And then you've got these people who are making a soulful case for a soulless universe in which you don't have a soul. And that would be the Richard Dawkins kind of people. Then there are the people who assume that there is no soul in the universe, and they write soulless prose about how you don't have a soul. And this would be a certain kind of scientific nerd. And they can't quite pull it off. For example, there are researchers who want to tell you that you're just chemical compounds. This would include the researchers who argue for determinism. So they're saying, choose determinism. They're saying, convince yourself that you're not a self. They're saying, you might try to believe that you try and believe, but you don't. It's a funny line, but there really are people who are out there doing that. I will talk soulfully. I believe in the value of trying to make this stuff as intuitive and resonant as possible. And I will explain how you got a soul. How you ended up being the spirited critter you are. Spirited and thoughtful and reasoning. I mean, not just a beast. You're something else, being a human, and your capacity to wonder about all this stuff. But I do have to start with a soulless universe. I have to explain how soul emerges within it. I'm doing this all grounded in the work of Terence Deacon, who I've collaborated with for close to 30 years. Really interesting mind to play with. I feel very grateful to be able to play with him on this stuff. I wouldn't have gotten around to these questions if it weren't that I got to hang with this guy for so long and that he was so patient and receptive and wasn't busy tooting his own horn. One way he describes what he's doing is that it's as bad as trying to explain a joke. I guess this is a tie-in to irony. I don't think life is a joke. I take it very seriously, and I also think it's a hoot. But people mostly don't want a soulless explanation for a joke or for anything meaningful. So this is like pulling back the curtains and trying to understand what we are realistically. But it also includes how unrealistic we have to be. If you found my work through any of my videos, you're probably picking up on some of that. I'm really fascinated by our need for illusion, and I don't disdain it. I mean, I'm an atheist, but don't get me wrong, I'm as delusional as the next guy. I need my optimal illusions. I need to kid myself. Life would be unbearable if I was a realist all the time. I am trying to be a realist about my need for unrealistic perspectives, for hopeful perspectives, for romantic perspectives. I do need to interpret reality that way. I am this peculiar mix. I speak way more colorfully than Deacon does. At the end of the conference, the leader said that he talked almost as much as Jeremy Sherman. I didn't talk that much, but I sure talked more colorfully than other people did at the conference. I speak colorfully, but I'm telling a story about how your soul emerged in a soulless universe, how your soul is real. I can explain how it's real without any special pleadings from dualistic realms, whether they be religious, spiritual, or scientific. I think information is real and that interpretation is real, but I don't get to simply assume information. I have to explain interpretation. I don't think anything in the physical universe is informational until it's about something for someone trying to do something. Only when you have selves making functional interpretive effort do you get interpretation. What is interpretation? It's treating some physical difference as if it is significant by actually responding to it. So I will be following up this podcast episode with one that lays out the simple process by which the default becomes less and less likely. And starting with the default of things falling apart and ending with why it's uncommonly likely that you'll be alive tomorrow to hear my next podcast episode if you want.